Hello. Cambridge. All good, will that do? The important thing is the date, because this is the release date. So
You've been in the village so many years, never seen you?
how good of you to come. Deeply appreciate it. Have you not been out this way before?
Basically,
I just want to say, we moved here just on nearly 10 years ago now. I was sitting having a drink over there, and I saw the wall hanging behind Gemma there, and which tells a very truncated version of the story. And I thought, oh well, that's a nice story about witches and stuff. But being who I am, I came several more times. I thought, hang on. And I started doing research because I just am a researcher by heart. And one thing led to another, which I won't bore you with, out to the Woodhorn, out to the Newcastle Library, out to the printed transcripts of what Anne Armstrong said in 1673. And then finally to the National Archives in Kew, where I found the actual, what was written down as she spoke, the actual documents. And it just, that sort of thing just does me in, you know. That was as close as I was going to get to this girl's voice. We don't know if she was 14, we know she was youngish. And I also discovered that a couple of historians had looked into this tale. Jim Sharp from York, David, yes. The transcripts are, by the way, there are. We've put some of them in the book so you can get an idea, both the transcripts and the actual written depositions, so you can see where I developed the story from. What you heard now was in total about 20 to 25 lines of evidence, so I've imagined a little bit around that. But I've tried to stick, you know, I suddenly just got overwhelmed by the thought that this woman was clearly, we can talk about it later if you want to know, turned down by the courts. She gave that evidence in Newcastle, was, we think, turned down because the court records from the 11th century to now of the quarter sessions and the assizes in Northumberland are complete, absolutely complete, except from 1650 to 1680. There's no records. They disappeared, and we're in 1673. Now, historians have started Anne's story a couple of times and famously just given up because there isn't enough evidence to tell her story. And I thought, sod that. That's when serious historical novelists walk in where historians fear to tread and try and, as close to the evidence as possible, imagine what that voice was. I just became utterly, totally obsessed with wanting that voice to be heard again. And today, the 2nd of April, is the official release date of Anne's voice in my own sort of way, coming back into the world, but with her documents for you to read as well in the book, and with the transcripts, because, you know, she matters to me more than whatever else I've tried to do. So that was the background to the story. You'd have gathered the Packhorse Bridge. If you don't know Riding Mill, you literally cross the 695 carefully. Cars come down Holland Hill very quickly. The trick is to look in the windows of the mill and you'll see the lights, then you don't cross. The mill, that was all that was here then. The mill, and then in 1660 this building was built, the Riding House, which has become the Wellington. Long story behind that, which is in the book. And yeah, so the Packhorse, you just pass to the left of the mill and it's there. It was built in 1600. That version, we suspect there's a much older one there, possibly Roman originally. And that's where they danced, that's where they met. And then she's brought into this building. But she's turned down, she goes to Morpeth for the quarter sessions, she appears 3 more times. We think she's turned down again, mainly because there's no record of anybody being imprisoned or or held over to the court sessions, or more importantly, the assizes, which is where crimes warranting the death penalty were held at the assizes. So we just don't know what happened. And she appears again then back before Ralph Jennison in Newcastle, and then she goes up to Hayden Bridge, and then she goes out to the Ridleys, and she goes eventually up to Allendale, carrying the story from 3 witches to 30 odd by the end. Not having made herself, we gather, very popular in the area of the riding, which this was then. And so just very briefly to end, a long story which is recounted in the novel. She gives her last evidence in Allendale and disappears from the record. No record of anywhere. I've searched every parish record of the period within striking distance of a roughly 14-year-old girl at the time. The likelihood is suicide then, buried not on parish ground, or what else? What local law will tell you, is that she was found hanged in that same room where the witches were touching the rope. That room, as I say, is on the way to the loo. It's the door on your left as you walk down. It's been many things. It was then the scullery of the riding house, where all the dirty work behind the kitchen was done. It became the snug when this was turned into a pub, and was a very nice place. It had a pool table at one stage. You'll be delighted to know now it's the beer cellar, so you can't go in, because we can't go underground here, we're too near the Tyne, so that's where your beer is being pumped from, is the room where Anne was apparently found hanged, either by her own hand, we're told, or by 30-odd people who had a very good reason to say, you should shut up now. So she's gone. Some say she's gone. There are much stronger rumours, including, by the way, articles in the Courant, the journal, that interviews with landlords here who say she's not gone at all. And there's a long history of people hating going into the little back room, or the beer cellar, it's now known. And a lot of people believe, including one deputy manager who left here, but when he heard I was doing this work, made a meeting with me and told me of things he experienced here. So some of that appears in the book too. There's a modern period as well. But that's, all I'll say, other than most people apparently don't like to go up to the top end of the dining room where the big fireplace is. For some reason, men especially won't go up there and put their beer down. They'll drink anywhere else but not there. For no good reason. They just don't. That's right next to the little back room. I'll stop now. If there are a few brief questions, I'll be happy to answer them and let you get back to much more important things. Does anybody want to ask anything in particular?
Yes, was there a history of witch fighting in the Tyne Valley then? Is this just an isolated incident?
Yeah.
Because in some areas, there were the witches of Pendle, for instance.
Exactly. The Pendle witches are 1612. The last big witches in the northeast are 1648 to 1650 in Newcastle, where 18 people were hanged. But of course, famously, the witchfinder, the Scottish witchfinder who gave the sort of evidence Anne is giving, was found to have been lying and doing it for money. He was being paid 20 shillings a witch, and was hanged in Scotland, not here. And the two reasons I think Anne's evidence was rejected. By 1633, the courts were not wanting witchcraft charges anymore. There's no conviction 50 years around Anne's period. There are lots of reports, people on the ground reporting witches, but the courts and even the king, whose father had been very pro-witch hunting, had stopped hunting witches. And it was also considered to be a bit backward to still believe in witches. There's one problem. And the north was considered to be a hotbed of people who believed in witches. We won't make the connection, but the courts at the time did. And the justices were very cautious not to be seen as being foolish and believing such evidence. The other thing was witchcraft was believed to be popish belief, Catholic. It's pretty clear that every single one of these justices of the peace that were secret Catholics, and their families were. But they could not admit to it. They would lose their state positions if they did. So she's running into a whole period of people choosing not to believe in witchcraft by 1673. So it's very different to 1612. It's very different to 1648 to 1650, and it's at the tail end of witchcraft accusations. historically. I hope does that
And yet, the last trial for witchcraft was 1944.
World War II, absolutely, yes. Yeah, yeah. But it was, it was a particular turning in that whole period. Plenty of belief on the ground, and the courts often had to look as if they were listening to people, because otherwise they had trouble. But they didn't necessarily want cases to go through. Hope that helps. Anything else?
Sorry.
I'm quite happy to just. There's still people trying to sneak in. Well, they can watch the film. I'll only say one thing about, a lot of people when you're doing this, and I've been picked up, God help me, by the new dark heritage thing that's going on. One of the groups who's following me on Twitter, I clicked onto it, and it was Wicca this and Wicca that and Witch this. I don't have a firm belief other than in Anne's voice. So I just want to say the most important line in the book, and it repeats 3 times, is her answer to Justice Jensen, which he didn't ask her that and she didn't answer. But do you believe you were turned into a horse? And she says, when you are ridden, you are a horse. And that is my only statement on whether I believe Anne Armstrong or not. I'll only say 2 things got me in the evidence, particularly in the National Archives working with the documents. One is I'm utterly convinced she was fully sincere and desperate, increasingly desperate as this went on. There could be a number of reasons for that. I am very concerned not to explain her away with any of our modern interpretations of witchcraft. That doesn't concern Anne Armstrong in 1673. She was who she was, and she said what she said. And I, for one, just caught the commitment and the urgency in her voice. So that was one thing. The other thing is those depositions, and if there are no more questions, I'll just end with this. She has to make her mark. She's illiterate. And so on the first deposition, that's the first one I was reading from tonight, she finishes, the clerk's written it down. We've only got his version of what she said, as I hope was coming through. I'm trying to imagine what she was actually saying from what the clerk wrote down. But she signs at the end. She draws, I'm not sure which came first, a heavy black dot. And you can see she's not used to holding a quill because it's kind of a bit messy. And then she tries to draw a circle around it. Being who I am, a couple of weeks of my life was spent on reading signatures and marks that people made, and there's a lot of scholarship on this, and it's typical of teenage girls to draw a heavy dot and draw a circle around it. Here am I exist, heavy dot, protect me. Circle. So I don't know, but she did draw that, it's there. And it's reproduced in the book. You can see it as clear as day. And this goes on through Newcastle, Morpeth 3 times, back at Newcastle again. And then when she starts looking for the Ridleys, sorry I said Ridleys only, the Ridleys up at Hayden Bridge, she gives some evidence and she draws, suddenly, from a circle with a dot, consistently over a number of depositions, it's suddenly a kind of squiggle line. And now none of that's in the transcriptions. You have to see the actual documents to see this. I thought, what on earth why is she? But dutifully, the clerk, as he has written under all the circles and dots, he's written Anne Armstrong, her mark. Anne Armstrong, they didn't care what she drew there. They couldn't care less, as long as she made a mark. Then that's her evidence. And she was never allowed to depart from it again. You could not correct that. You could not change that. The next time, she draws what looks like a McDonald's sign, sort of M. And I thought, hang on. I went back to the one before and I thought, well, if you turn that squiggle line sideways, it's sort of an attempt at an M. But who the hell is M? In the one after that, she draws, and this is the very last deposition she gives up in Allendale, where she's called out to say if someone's a witch. She gives her evidence, and she draws an absolutely perfect single A with a dot after it. She's trying to learn to right, to be herself, to control this media. She knows what she's saying into the air is being put on paper, and that's her story. She's trying to assert, to get some control, to be there. And then suddenly you understand, with each bit of evidence she gives, it changes. Like all this nonsense about flying on horses and food and all, the justice couldn't care less, because that was popery. That was the witches of Europe. The closest you ever got it in English, well, in what we now call British, accusations was Scotland, because that was very European. And they had the same, that's why they burnt witches, which we didn't do. We hanged them. I could say we, my family was only out of the country for 90 years before I came back. So she's telling a kind of witchcraft. The Pendle witches are the only other ones who give what we would now call, a witches' gathering, of the type we use now. Nowhere else in English witchcraft did you get that, and the justices couldn't care less. Why? Because you can't prosecute people for pulling on a rope and getting food. You can prosecute them for what they called maleficium, harm to people, or worse still, their animals. Okay, and Anne, you see her grading. She's reading the court as the court is reading her. This was a bright kid. This was a woman who was really attempting to engage with the world on its terms, despite being illiterate, living in a little clearing way up the Tyne Valley, which was considered utterly remote, and she accuses people in Slaley and Edmundbyres and a whole circle of villages around here. But the whole time, she's working out what the courts will hear and what they won't hear. And what they won't hear is what you were hearing tonight, her first evidence. That to them was just utterly dismissible. So, when you gather from your subject, when you're reading those documents and you start getting that feeling of somebody who is really working at this, who's determined and desperate and determined, you just got to write a story. So that's what I did anyway. So there we are. Thanks, everybody.